The citadel of Valorian rose from the obsidian plains like a monument to eternity, its crystalline spires refracting light into 1,000 prismatic colors that painted the purple sky in impossible hues. Jasper Novak stood in the maintenance tunnel 3 levels beneath the grand amphitheater, his calloused hands gripping a thermal calibrator as the entire structure thrummed. With accumulated power, the binding ceremony was beginning, and every sensor in the lower levels registered the surge of ancient magic coursing through the Imperial conduits. He shouldn't be paying attention. Maintenance technicians were meant to be invisible ghost workers in the shadows of grand architecture, present but unseen, acknowledged only when something broke. Jasper had learned this lesson well across 15 years of working in alien cities, serving species far older and seemingly far greater than humanity. But something in the rhythm of today's energy patterns felt wrong. The harmonics were discordant, like a symphony where half the orchestra was playing in a different key. The communicator on his belt crackled. "Novak, report status on Sector 7. It was his supervisor, Mender Voss, a four-armed Valorian whose skin shimmered like liquid mercury. Despite their vast biological differences, Voss had always treated Jasper with professional courtesy, which on this world meant he was mostly ignored. "All systems nominal, Mender. Crystal resonators holding steady at 92% capacity," Jasper replied, his voice steady despite his growing unease. He was careful never to volunteer information, never to ask questions. Questions drew attention, and attention from the Valorian authority was rarely pleasant for humans. "Remain at station. The ceremony will conclude in approximately 6 hours. We may require structural adjustments." The communicator fell silent. Jasper returned his attention to the diagnostic panel, but his eyes kept drifting toward the ancient wiring that connected directly to the ceremony chamber above. In his years among the Valorian, he'd learned to read energy patterns the way musicians read musical notation, and this pattern was screaming in pain. Curiosity, that most dangerous trait of his species, got the better of him. Jasper moved through the maintenance tunnels with practiced silence, his footsteps absorbed by the humming floor. The Valorian had built their empire on surveillance and control, but they'd made one critical error. They never imagined anyone would voluntarily approach the sacred ceremonies. Invisibility, Jasper had discovered, was the greatest camouflage. He reached the observation grate in Maintenance Tunnel 3, just as he'd discovered during his first month working in the Citadel. The position provided a partial view of the amphitheater below, enough to understand what was happening, not enough to be noticed by security systems calibrated to scan for obvious threats, rather than maintenance workers in their expected positions. What Jasper saw stole his breath. The amphitheater resembled the interior of a vast crystal geoda, its walls carved from a single piece of luminescent stone that glowed with violet and silver light. Hundreds of Valorian nobility occupied tiered seating, their crystalline bodies faceted like living gems, their eyes gleaming with predatory interest. In the center of the floor, suspended within a matrix of light beams that formed an intricate geometric pattern, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20 solar cycles, her form still developing the full faceting of adult Valorian physiology. Her skin caught the light with an opalescent quality, and her hair, if it could be called that, was more like spun glass threaded with actual starlight. She floated in the center of the light matrix, and even from Jasper's distant vantage point, he could see her trembling. "The binding ceremony of the heir apparent is commenced," a voice like grinding crystal announced. An older female Valorian, her form larger and more densely faceted than the others, descended from the highest tier. Her presence carried such weight that the air itself seemed to compress. The Empress Morrigan, ruler of the Valorian Empire for 3,000 years, keeper of the ancient crystalline protocols, architect of an authority that stretched across 17 star systems. "Princess Rafini," Empress Morrigan continued, her voice carrying harmonics that Jasper felt in his bones. "You approach the threshold of your destiny. To rule the Valorian Accord as heir, you must undergo the binding, the transformation that will wed your consciousness to the collective crystalline matrix, making you simultaneously individual and unified with all who have come before." Below, the girl's trembling intensified. Jasper instinctively moved closer to the grate, his eyes narrowing with concern. He'd witnessed 3 binding ceremonies during his tenure in the Citadel. They were brutal things, beautiful in their terrible way, the young Valorians' consciousness expanding, their physical form crystallizing further, their individual identity subordinating itself to the collective will of the Empire. The process was supposed to be glorious, a transcendence, but something in Princess Serafine's body language suggested this ceremony was going terribly wrong. The light beams intensified, shifting from violet to a searing white that made Jasper squint even through the grate. The princess's form began to change, her skin facets multiplying, new geometric patterns etching themselves across her body. It should have been instantaneous, a moment of transcendent transformation. Instead, it was prolonged, and her body began to arc with what could only be described as agony. Her screams echoed through the amphitheater, not roars of triumph, but the desperate cries of someone experiencing profound pain. The Empress didn't move. The assembled nobility didn't move. They watched with the passive interest one might show observing a scientific experiment. Detached and clinical, Jasper felt something break inside his chest. He'd spent 15 years learning not to feel too much about the Valorians' cruelty. It was the only way to survive. But this was different. This was a person, barely more than a child, experiencing torture while an empire watched and called it tradition. Before conscious thought could stop him, before the part of his brain that valued self-preservation could apply its usual governance, Jasper was moving. He slipped the maintenance grate open with the override code he'd memorized. During his 3rd week on the job, he dropped into the amphitheater with barely a sound, his human form so insignificant against the vast chamber that for a moment, no one noticed. Then someone did. Security breach, a guard called out, but Jasper was already moving toward the princess, already placing himself between her and the light beams that were causing such obvious suffering. "Stand down," Empress Morrigan commanded, and the guards halted, puzzled. A human, unauthorized entry to the sacred ceremony? It was so unprecedented that it created a moment of confused paralysis. "Your Majesty," Jasper called out, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "The princess is in distress. The crystalline matrix is misaligned. Look at the harmonic patterns, they're fragmented. The binding isn't synchronizing correctly." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Empress Morrigan laughed, a sound like crystal bells filled with ice water. "How dare you? A human mechanic presumes to understand our most sacred traditions." "I understand resonance," Jasper said quietly. He'd moved directly beneath the light matrix, directly into the beams themselves. They burned his skin instantly. These were not forces meant for human biology, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at Princess Serafine's agonized face. "I understand pain, and I understand that something is wrong." Their eyes met. What happened next defied every law of Valorian biology and imperial tradition. The light beams flickered. The harmonic pattern that had been fragmenting suddenly realigned, finding stability not through the princess's forced transformation, but through an entirely unexpected resonance. Jasper's human bioelectric field weak compared to Valorian crystalline energy, but surprisingly coherent, synchronized with the princess's fractured pattern. The pain in her face transformed. Her body stopped convulsing. Her breathing, which had been ragged and desperate, deepened into something almost meditative. The light around them shifted from searing white to a gentle, harmonious blend of violet and silver. And in that moment, as the beams recalibrated and the binding ceremony unexpectedly succeeded through a mechanism that shouldn't have been possible, Jasper felt something awaken inside him. It was like touching a live wire and suddenly understanding electricity not as abstract science, but as pure, vivid experience. The light faded. Princess Serafini descended gently, her form now fully transformed, her crystalline structure bearing the marks of one who had undergone the binding. But something was different. Her eyes, now glowing with internal luminescence, searched Jasper's face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "What's your name?" she whispered, her voice like wind through crystalline caves, beautiful and haunting. "Jasper," he managed. "Jasper Novak. I'm just maintenance." "No," Serafini said. And even as guards moved to restrain him, even as Empress Morrigan descended from her throne with an expression Jasper couldn't quite read, Serafine's hand reached out and touched his chest. Where she touched him, His burned skin began to cool. "You're far more than maintenance. You're the one who heard me screaming and refused to look away." And in that instant, with her hand over his heart and their eyes locked across the divide of species and social hierarchy and imperial law, Jaspi. The holding chamber beneath the citadel was not a prison. Exactly the Valorian were to civilize for something as crude as metal bars. Instead, Jasper found himself in a room with transparent crystalline walls that were impossible to break, and equally impossible to see through from the outside. He could see the guards stationed beyond, their forms shadowy and indistinct, but they could observe him with perfect clarity. The irony wasn't lost on him. Total surveillance masquerading as comfort, control disguised as transparency. He'd been detained for 6 hours, long enough to assume the worst execution was the traditional punishment for disrupting sacred ceremonies, long enough to replay the moment Serafine's hand touched his chest over and over in his mind, examining it like an engineer examining a failed component, searching for the exact moment everything went impossibly wrong, or impossibly right. He wasn't sure anymore. The crystalline wall nearest him shimmered. Jasper stood, expecting guards. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows of Valorian he'd seen during the ceremony, one of the nobility from the lower tiers. His form was less densely faceted than the Empress, but his bearing suggested significant authority. His skin held the deep blue-green hue of age and power, and his eyes were sharp with calculation. "I am Advisor Theron," the figure said without preamble, "keeper of ancient protocols and counsel to the Empress. You have created a considerable problem, human." Jasper straightened, keeping his expression neutral. "I was attempting to solve one. The princess's binding was failing. The harmonic patterns were." "I'm aware of what the patterns were doing," Theron interrupted, moving closer to the crystalline wall. "I've reviewed the chamber recordings 7 times. The unprecedented synchronization between human bioelectric fields and our crystalline matrix technology shouldn't have been possible. It violates 3,000 years of empirical understanding. And yet, it occurred. I didn't do anything," Jasper said carefully. "I was just there. My presence seemed to help stabilize the frequency." "Your presence did more than stabilize," Theron said, and something in his tone shifted, less accusatory, more analytical. "Your presence transformed the binding itself. Princess Serafini has bonded not merely to the collective consciousness, but to you. Her consciousness maintains a distinct, harmonic signature that resonates with your bioelectric field. It's an anomaly. A beautiful one, perhaps, but an anomaly nonetheless." Jasper's pulse quickened. Did she survive? Is she healthy?" Theron studied him with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "The princess is remarkably well, better than she was during the pre-binding evaluations. Her crystalline structure is perfect. Her integration with the collective consciousness is stable, and she refuses to stop asking about your condition." A pause, laden with subtext. "This is problematic. Why? If she's healthy, if the binding was successful." "Because," Theron said, moving away from the wall, "the Empress has already contracted her to Lord Kale of the Obsidian Guard. The marriage ceremony is scheduled for 3 months hence. Lord Kale is one of the greatest warriors. Our empire has produced. His bloodline carries the ancient crystalline protocols. His power is matched only by his loyalty to the throne. This union was meant to secure the succession and strengthen imperial authority." The words hit like a physical blow. Jasper had spent 15 years maintaining emotional distance, and it had taken one moment with Serafini to dismantle it entirely. "She didn't choose this. The princess chose to be born royal," Theron said, not unkindly. "All choices after that were predetermined. This is the nature of imperial responsibility. That's not a choice. That's a sentence." Theron turned back to regard him with something that might have been respect, or might have been mild amusement. "You think very clearly about things that do not concern you, human. This will probably get you executed." He paused. "I'm recommending otherwise. You will be detained here for observation, but not harmed. Your employment is suspended pending investigation." "Investigation of what?" "Of how a maintenance technician from the outer settlements happened to possess knowledge of harmonic resonance. That's typically restricted to crystalline theorists. Of why your bioelectric signature contains patterns we've only read about in theoretical literature, on human-alien bonding protocols, of whether you represent a threat to imperial stability or an opportunity for unprecedented scientific advancement. Theron reached the wall again, his faceted hand resting against the transparent crystalline surface. The Empress is displeased and intrigued in equal measure, which means you're in a dangerous position. My recommendation is that you remain cooperative and invisible. Invisible I can do, Jasper said, though even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. He would never be invisible to Serafini again. But I had no knowledge of any of this. I'm just a mechanic, so you keep saying, Theron replied, and disappeared back into shadow. 3 nights later, Jasper was moved to a larger chamber equipped with actual furniture, a clear signal that he wasn't facing immediate execution. The chamber was still transparent, still impossible to escape from, but it was less like a cell and more like a residence. He'd been provided with access to a terminal, through which he could access maintenance logs and technical documentation. It seemed the Empress wanted him occupied, perhaps hoping he would provide useful information about his biological capabilities. Through his research patterns, he was studying the theoretical literature on human-alien bonding protocols, the information Theron had mentioned when the wall shimmered. For a moment, Jasper thought it was another official visit. Then he saw her, and every breath stopped in his body. Serafini was no longer wearing the ceremonial garments of her binding. Instead, she dressed herself in flowing robes that seemed to be woven from actual starlight silver, and violet threads that caught and refracted illumination in hypnotic patterns. Her crystalline form had settled into its post-binding configuration, and if anything, she was more beautiful than before, her facets refined by the successful transformation into a perfect geometric expression of Valorian artistry. But it was her eyes that stopped him, those glowing, luminous eyes that contained something he'd never expected to see in a royal heir: genuine, unguarded emotion. I've been maintaining the chamber's security protocols, she said softly, her voice filling the silence with those crystalline harmonics that made his chest ache. The guards see me entering for official questioning. They don't see what actually happens when I bypass the surveillance feeds, Your Highness. Jasper started, standing. This is extremely dangerous. If anyone discovers you here, Serafini, she interrupted. My name is Serafini, not Your Highness. And yes, it's dangerous. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. She moved closer to him, and Jasper realized with a start that the transparent wall between them had been temporarily disabled. She was truly here, in the same space, breathing the same air. I've spent my entire life being told what I'm supposed to be. Guardian of the Empire, bearer of traditions, wife to a man I've never spoken to. She stopped an arm's length away. And then I heard you screaming for me. No, that's not right. I heard you refusing to look away when I was screaming. That's entirely different. The binding worked because of me, Jasper said carefully. There's a biological compatibility we don't understand. Your father's advisors are investigating. I've read the advisors' reports, Serafini said. I have access to every classified document in the Citadel. 3,000 years of research into human-alien bonding protocols that were supposed to be extinct knowledge. Do you want to know what's truly forbidden in the Valorian archives? She reached out and took his hand gently, as though he were something that might shatter. The answer is us. The possibility of us. Millennia ago, human and Valorian bonding was the cornerstone of our civilizations. We built empires together, shared consciousness, created technology and art and understanding. Then the early emperors decided such bonds threatened imperial authority. They classified all protocols related to human-alien connection. They separated our species. They told everyone it was impossible. But it's not impossible, Jasper said, understanding flooding through him. That's what happened in the ceremony. Your binding didn't fail, it transformed. You bonded to me because we're meant to be compatible, more than compatible, Serafini said. Her grip on his hand tightened, and where her crystalline skin touched his, warmth spread through his entire arm. Since the binding, I can feel you. When you're within the Citadel, I sense your presence like a harmonic note I can't quite reach. When you're not, there's an absence in my consciousness. It's not painful, but it's present, constant. She pulled his hand upward, placing it over her heart. where her crystalline structure pulsed with internal light. There was a section that glowed in a pattern that exactly mirrored his own bioelectric rhythm. When he'd been immersed in the binding beams, "You're written into me now, and I'm aware enough to understand that I don't want to be written out of you." Jasper should have stepped back. He should have reminded her of imperial law, of Lord Kale, of the impossible gulf between what they both wanted and what the galaxy's structure would permit. Instead, he stepped closer. "I've known you for 6 hours," he said quietly. "That's not enough, Tim." The secret meetings lasted 43 days. Jasper counted them obsessively, mapping each moment like a mechanic tracking a system's degradation, each stolen kiss, bringing them closer to inevitable discovery. Each whispered conversation in the transparent chamber a luxury borrowed from a future that wouldn't permit it. Serafini had given him access to the archives, and together they'd studied the ancient protocols, understanding more deeply what their connection meant. They weren't anomalies. They were echoes of something that had once been celebrated, then systematically erased. The end came not with imperial guards, but with a message. Serafini arrived at their meeting point wearing formal attire, the crystalline robes of state, adorned with symbols of her position. Her luminous eyes held tears that seemed impossible for a being made of crystal, yet somehow managed to shine with genuine anguish. "My father knows," she said without preamble. "Not everything, but enough. There were inconsistencies in the surveillance feeds. Advisor Theron covered for us as long as he could, but the Empress demanded a full investigation." Jasper's heart moved into dangerous territory somewhere between terror and resignation. "What does she plan to do?" "That's the remarkable part," Serafini said, moving close enough that he could feel the subtle vibration of her crystalline form. "She's furious. She's also intrigued, and she's giving me a choice." Serafini took his hands, her grip both gentle and desperate. "She's invoking an ancient law, the Tournament of Hearts. It hasn't been used in 500 years, but it exists in the Imperial Code. Any member of the royal line can challenge an arranged marriage by proposing an alternative trial. If a suitor can prove themselves worthy through this trial, the Empress must honor the challenge." "What kind of trial?" Jasper asked, though dread was already coiling through his chest. "Traditionally, it's a combat challenge. The suitor must defeat a series of warriors to prove their strength and worthiness." Serafine's voice trembled. "But the law allows for alternatives if the royal proposing the trial specifies different parameters." "Jasper, I'm proposing a tournament of hearts. Instead of testing combat prowess, it will test compassion, understanding, and the capacity for genuine human or alien connection. Your mother will never allow it." "My mother," Serafini said, and there was strength in her voice now, the crystalline harmonics resonating with determination, "is 3,000 years old and has grown bored with predictability. She's also aware that the Empire is weakening. The ancient protocols we've been studying, they're failing because they were built on dominance and fear. The Valorian civilization is crystallizing, literally becoming brittle. She knows this. Theron knows this. And I think, deep down, she's curious what might happen if we tried something different." Serafini reached up and touched his face. "But you would have to enter. You would have to stand in that arena and be tested. And if you fail, Lord Kale will claim his marriage right, and the Empire will execute you for the presumption of challenging a warrior's authority." Jasper should have hesitated. He should have voiced concerns about the impossible odds, about the danger, about the fact that he was a maintenance technician with no combat training, facing crystalline warriors who'd trained their entire lives for warfare. Instead, he heard himself say, "When 3 weeks, Serafini said. "The Empress is announcing the tournament tomorrow. Lord Kale will be furious, but he'll participate. He has to refuse would mean surrendering his claim to me, and admitting that the new trial parameters make him uncertain." She paused. "There will be other warriors too, at least 5. The Empire's greatest champions, and the trial itself. The Empress hasn't decided yet, but I've requested something specific: trials that test wisdom, empathy, and the ability to solve problems without destruction." "She's considering it." Serafine's eyes searched his. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe you could do this. I've felt your mind through our bond, Jasper. You're more capable than you know." The announcement came at the Imperial Assembly. Jasper watched from the maintenance level above, his access granted by Advisor Theron who, it turned out, had been far more complicit in their meetings than Jasper realized. The Empress Morrigan descended from her throne in the grand amphitheater, her crystalline form catching light in hypnotic patterns. A challenge has been proposed to the arranged marriage of Princess Serafini to Lord Kael. Of the Obsidian Guard, the Empress declared, her voice resonating through every chamber and communicator in the Citadel. The princess invokes the ancient law of the Tournament of Hearts. Any warrior who wishes to prove their worthiness may enter the competition. The victor shall claim the princess's hand, or her blessing to refuse marriage entirely. The trials will test not martial prowess, but the deeper qualities that create lasting bonds, compassion, wisdom, and the capacity for genuine understanding. The amphitheater erupted in shocked murmurs. Valorian tradition held that strength was measured in combat, in victory over opponents. The concept of measuring worth through emotional capacity seemed almost offensive to imperial sensibilities, yet no one moved to stop it. The Empress's decision was absolute law. Jasper saw Lord Kael stand in his section of the amphitheater. The warrior was even more impressive in person than Jasper had anticipated. His crystalline form was dense and faceted with obvious age and experience. His frame larger than most Valorian, his presence commanding. When Kel's eyes swept the chamber and found Jasper in the maintenance level, understanding and contempt flooded his expression simultaneously. He knows, Jasper realized. He understands exactly what's happening here. The tournament began on a crystalline platform constructed within the Grand Arena. Jasper stood with 5 other competitors, 3 Valorian warriors whose names meant nothing to him, a Velthian trader whose multiple eyes regarded everyone with calculating interest, and Lord Kael, whose presence seemed to swallow light. Serafini presided from the royal box, her luminous eyes fixed on Jasper with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. The Empress Morrigan sat beside her daughter, her ancient form radiating absolute authority. Thousands of Valorian nobility occupied the tiers. Every significant power player in the Empire had come to witness the unprecedented tournament. The herald, the same crystalline functionary who'd announced the binding ceremony, stepped forward. The first trial is the Chamber of Needs. Each competitor will enter a sealed environment where they will encounter beings requiring assistance. The measure of success is not the speed of completion, but the quality of care demonstrated. The first competitor, a Valorian warrior named Vex, entered his chamber and immediately tried to use force to solve every problem. When confronted with a malfunctioning irrigation system, he attempted to break it into submission. When faced with a confused child, he tried to command compliance. He failed spectacularly, exhausting himself and accomplishing nothing. One by one, the warriors entered and largely demonstrated the same approach. Combat training had prepared them to defeat enemies, not to understand and assist the vulnerable. Their failure was consistent and almost poignant. These beings had spent their lives perfecting strength and had never learned to wield gentleness. Lord Kel's approach was different. He entered his chamber and immediately assessed the situation with tactical precision. He identified the problems, created efficient solutions, and accomplished measurable results. The spectators erupted in approval. Kael had demonstrated his capacity for strategic thinking and problem solving. It was a legitimate performance. Then it was Jasper's turn. He stepped into the chamber, and it took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. The beings weren't separate creatures, they were parts of an ecosystem. A water system in collapse, a food production area contaminated, an elderly Valorian with a damaged crystal structure, a young child who was sick from environmental toxins, a refugee from an outer colony who'd been displaced by war. Jasper spent the first 5 minutes simply observing. He'd learned in 15 years of maintenance work that rushing into problems usually created new ones. He walked the space, touched the systems, listened to the beings describe their situations in their own words. The water system had a crystalline filtration component that was misaligned, a simple fix. With the right tool, Jasper found the thermal calibrator they'd left for him and adjusted it. The water began flowing again. The contaminated food area required understanding that the contamination came from an external leak, not the food itself. He sealed the leak and showed the being tending the crops how to salvage most of the growth. The elderly Valorian's crystal structure needed gentle realignment. Jasper worked for nearly an hour, carefully using his bioelectric field to ease the damaged portions back into functional configuration. The sick child needed simple medical attention and environmental isolation until recovery. The refugee needed information about available resources and the understanding that they weren't alone in their displacement. None of these solutions involved conquest. None of them required victory over an opponent. They required only careful attention to what was actually needed rather than what assumed dominance was supposed to accomplish. When Jasper emerged from the chamber, the amphitheater had gone quiet. The judges conferred with the Empress. Then the herald announced the human combat